welcome to Newcastle. Of course, being the network of excellence in pharmacogenetics and medicines optimization, we wanted to jump onto the success of the local team winning a trophy for the first time in 70 years. Of course, my team duly sort of completely capitulated in the final just to make sure everyone was happy in the Northeast, so that's very good. And so, first of all, before I do anything, I'd like to thank Emma Groves and the team for hosting us and for all the energy and effort today. So, a couple of things. If you hear a fire alarm, it's real. And so, be calm and walk out that way or that way. I think, yeah, that sounds good. Like, not very good if oxygen falls and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so you can see the complimentary Wi-Fi. Right, that's me. This is the third of these meetings. So we had one about a year ago in Liverpool to kick everything off. And actually, in the coming days, there will be a paper that will be published around some of the outputs from that meeting and how that is sort of building on some of the work that Munir and colleagues have done previously and sort of seeing the direction of travel now that the network of excellence is in place. So John McDermott and Maria, so John obviously here, you'll hear from a little bit later, but I've led that with Munir. So I think that'll be a really nice output and we'll share that with all the delegates when that's out in the coming days. And then, of course, we had a meeting in London at the end of last year, which was really great, and, of course, here today. So for those of you, most people I see, sort of familiar faces, but there may be a couple of people in the room a little bit less familiar with the Network of Excellence in Pharmacogenetics. This is funded by NHS England through the Genomics Unit, led by Sue, who will be giving a talk after this, and we've got a number of work packages, which some of them we will touch on today. Some of these are funded formal work packages, and others are bringing in other groups who have already got established programs of work. So all of this information is available on the website through the Northwest Genomic Medicine Service Alliance, and this is a partnership between the Northeast and Yorkshire GMSA and the one in the Northwest. And of course, in the Northeast, you've had a very strong reputation over a number of years, predominantly through the work of Anne Daly, who you'll see a little bit later, leading some really phenomenal pharmacogenetics programs. And so it's been great to have that partnership and obviously be here today. So some of the programs of work we won't focus on today, like our study, the progress study, but some of the things we will delve into in a little bit more detail, and I'll touch on that just in a second. But just to give you a sense of some of the highlights and some of the progress that we've made, that the study in primary care, the progress study that we've been initially leading in the Northwest with GP practices in Liverpool and in Manchester, have expanded up to Blackpool and Clitheroe. We're now national for that project, so we've got sites pretty much all around the country, which is great, and the work of Nicola and Eva and Amy, the team supporting us to get those sites open has been really great. We're now able, through the work of Scott and Vidya and Mike and others that have thought about how you move that information around the system, able to get those results appearing within GP records, within practices all around the country, and providing guidance around how those, what intervention should happen based on that information. So that's working really well, and I think in the next meeting we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So we've got a number of other projects going on, sort of point of care testing, which you're aware of. We've been very interested in Manchester for a number of years, thinking about that around the context of neonatal hearing loss associated with gentamicin. We've got a national programme which is extending beyond England into Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and that's working well, funded by NIHR, and we've been very keen to look through the Network of Excellence to see how we can raise funding from other organisations. And in that regard, since the last meeting, there's been a couple of successes. So Munir Pir Mohammed, who's here and you'll be aware of, has led a lot of pharmacogenetics initiatives across the country and internationally. Was awarded an Innovate UK CERSI award around regulation and innovation in pharmacogenomics, and there's a number of people from partners that are here today that are working with Munir around that programme of work. And then other funding stream from Innovate was an extension and expansion of our programme of work in Manchester called the Devote programme, where we're working with a number of smaller companies to develop either diagnostics or quality assurance materials. So today, that the next Network of Excellence event like this will be in Manchester on the 13th of November. I think we'll have a QR code or something that will pop up about that. If you, from today, have ideas about what you'd like to hear at that meeting, then do please let us know. We've already got some ideas ourselves, but we're very keen to hear of other things that you might like to know about. The European Society of Human Genetics runs a pharmacogenomics course. That's going to be on in a month's time. There's still availability if you want to register for that. QR code is there. It's in Slovenia. It's led by our colleague Vita Dolzan, and a number of colleagues from around Europe will be speaking at that. Then Munir, again, leads the UK Pharmacogenetics and Stratified Medicine Network. They've got a meeting at the Royal College of Physicians in London on the 18th of June. So you can click on the QR code in the middle, and that will take you to all the details about that. You can register and go to that. It's always an excellent meeting, which brings in a number of different perspectives. And then Ron is very much a leading member of the European Society of Pharmacogenetics and Personalised Therapies, or Therapeutics, I think. And Daly was the president of that society. He's now Nico Nimi. And they have their meeting in Rotterdam the 5th to the 8th of November. So get that in your diary, because it's always a really excellent meeting as well. So lots going on, lots of opportunities to engage around pharmacogenetics, irrespective of your starting point and your background. Okay, now next we're going to move on to a different sort of discussion, and this is going to be led by our wonderful colleague Vivian Parry, who has been a leading voice in genomics over a number of years, but that engagement with the public, listening to the voice, sort of reflecting that back and amplifying it and understanding what it is that we can really do in partnership. So I'm absolutely delighted to invite Vivian to the stage to set the scene for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. How lovely to be here. Now, as you know, I am a super enthusiast for genomics and always have been. But pharmacogenomics is the thing that I have been fixated on for many years. And it's funny, isn't it? I mean, genetics was my degree subject, and Sue was talking about slam dunks. I always thought about genetics as slam dunks. And over the years, I've realised that genetics isn't about slam dunks at all. It's very grey. It's not black and white at all. But with pharmacogenomics, it's a slam dunk. As far as the public are concerned, and all the work that I've done with the public, it can be summed up in kind of just 3 words. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? So I think the work that we do with patients is incredibly important, not just about providing the impetus and the support that's visible to government in terms of funding, but also in terms of they will be the people who determine how we actually implement and deliver. And patients are the Trojan horse of genomics. They will make it happen. And actually, instead of patient push, you have, or health service push, you have patient pull. And I think in genomics, pharmacogenomics, that is incredibly important. Patients are the key to all of your futures because they are the ones who will make it happen. Even, all your efforts, it's patients that have the potential to really make it happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 4 talks, including one, I'm delighted to say, from a patient. And first up, we're going to hear from John McDermott of course, Centre for Excellence in Manchester and a clinical geneticist. So John, let's start with you.
Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. So I want to speak today about some work we've done looking at how we can understand stakeholder preferences for pharmacogenetic testing and a pharmacogenetic testing service. And this was funded by the NIHR as part of a fellowship from a few years ago. So first of all, we really need to establish what do we mean by a pharmacogenetic testing service. A pharmacogenetic testing service is not the laboratory test, nor is it that single interaction between a clinician and a patient, but actually it's the combination and the interaction between those 2 areas. And I've spoken about this before, how you can think about single gene testing, you can think about panel-based testing, and lots of different models of service delivery. And you can combine them in lots of different ways. And really, a pharmacogenetic testing service, as with many clinical services, has to be end-to-end. And there's lots of different components to that. How do you order the test as a healthcare professional? How is the test done? Are you doing single gene testing? Are you doing panel testing? And then how are those results returned? Do people have access to those results? Who has access to those results? And there are choices to be made along that pathway as you are designing a clinical service. And how you go about that will differ depending on your area of need and the health service which you are part of. The question is, how do we make decisions around how that happens? And traditionally, that's been people like us sat in a room just making those decisions. But actually, we know getting the input from patients and from healthcare professionals is absolutely critical. And we know that those different components, they don't sit in blissful isolation of each other. They interact with each other in very complex ways. And in 2016, the Royal Academy of Engineering published a piece of work called Engineering Better Care, which looked at this systems-based approach to thinking about the design of healthcare. And people were at the core of that. Before you can do anything, you need to understand what your stakeholders, what your users need from the service that you are trying to design. And so defining the interactions and critically the preferences of our users and our stakeholders is fundamentally important. And our stakeholders make up the healthcare organisations, the laboratory testing services, the tech providers, but actually it's the interaction between your healthcare provider and your patients where you're going to drive action. You need to realise the intervention in that particular interaction. And so you can have the best laboratory test in the world, producing data with unparalleled accuracy and potentially even clinical utility. But unless you design a service that people can use and want to use, no one will use it and it will fail. So we aim to establish public and healthcare professionals for a pharmacogenetic testing service, and we're going to focus on the work we did around members of the public. And we worked with a team of excellent health economists to use tools around preference valuation. And there's lots of different tools that can be used. You can do revealed preferences, so you can look at what people do in the real world to understand what they want or what they need. Or you can look at stated preferences. You can ask them. And there's a number of different ways that you can do this. And we used a tool called discrete choice experiments, which breaks down a particular service into attributes. And it's important to talk a little bit about what we mean by attributes and levels. And I'm going to do this through a tortured analogy of running shoes. When you make decisions in life, when you go to a shop and you're deciding which product to buy, you're not making decisions based on them as homogeneous entities. Rather, you're making trade-offs between the various attributes, and you do that subconsciously. So if you're picking a running shoe, you might make decisions based on the brand of that shoe, whether it has a carbon plate, the durability, the ankle support, and critically the cost. And that awareness that actually different products have different attributes you can use that within a survey-based design. And then if you ask people to make choices about which product, which service they would choose again and again, and you do that iteratively through mathematical modelling, you can start to draw out the attributes and the levels that drive uptake. And that's what we did, not around running shoes, sadly, we did it around pharmacogenomics. So we conduct a discrete choice experiment, and it's a complex process to design and implement a piece of work like this, but you start with a choice question. We wanted to ask members of the public, if you had to choose one of these pharmacogenetic tests to help you guide your treatment, which would you choose? And you have to choose your attributes, and it's a bit of an art how you do that. We did that through engagement work with members of the public. We looked at the existing literature, and we chose 4 key areas: the type of test we were doing, data availability to the patient, whether that data was available in the future across the healthcare service, and the turnaround time of that particular test. We put all that into a survey, and we developed training material. And I want to show you just a very quick snippet of that training material to understand the choices
There
we're
are
asking
many ways
people
this
to make.
testing service can be developed, and the NHS are looking to understand the thoughts of patients and healthcare professionals before any plans are put into place. This survey will ask you to imagine you're a patient seeing your GP. They have offered a pharmacogenetic test to help choose the best medicine for you. You'll be presented with 2 alternative tests to choose from. Each test will have 4 features. You can use these to help make your decision. Let's look at these in more detail. You'll be asked to think about the type of sample you prefer to give: blood, saliva, or a cheek swab. You'll be presented with different ways you can access the test results. And, more broadly, whether the data is made available to the wider NHS to support future prescribing. Depending on how the data is stored by the NHS, the test results might just be used to help choose the best medicine for you at that particular moment in time, or they could be used to guide prescribing throughout your life. Finally, turnaround time is the time taken from requesting a test to the receipt of results. Some pharmacogenetic tests are very quick, others are slower. Thanks for listening. You'll now be given some more information on the survey before it begins.
Great. So patients were shown video like this, they had training material, and then they came to the survey itself. And this is the type of thing they saw. They were presented with pharmacogenetic test A, pharmacogenetic test B, the different attributes and levels within that, or they had an ability to opt out. But they were asked to make that choice. And if you were to present every theoretical possibility of that test against every theoretical possibility of that test, you'd be talking about over 6,500 different questions you'd be asking people. But using a mathematical design called de-efficient design, you could rationalize those into just 8 questions and maintain that same statistical robustness. We had 2 particular cohorts that we separated people into. We looked at either a patient presenting in pain and a patient presenting with low mood. And we wanted to do that to explore whether the acuity of the presentations might influence patients' decisions. And we aim to recruit at least 750 participants per scenario. And so we did that successfully across our scenarios. We had nearly 1,000 patients per scenario. And what we found, the first piece of work that we did, was to look to see whether there are any differences between our low mood scenario and our joint pain scenario, and we found no significant differences. So for the rest of the analysis, just bear in mind, we're looking at the total cohort. So the acuity of the presentation in this particular piece of work didn't seem to influence a patient's decision. This is what the data looks out coming out of a discrete choice experiment. It's incredibly dull, it's incredibly dry, but essentially the thing we're interested in is something called the coefficient. And I apologise to the health economists in the room, but broadly you can think of it as if that number is bigger than 0, people want that particular level in their service, that feature. If it's below 0, they don't want it. So the first thing to say here is a constant of 4.85, which is for the overall test itself, suggests that people want pharmacogenetic testing broadly. But you can take those very boring numbers and present them graphically, thankfully. And so what you can see here is that if you use a base case service, which is essentially how we deliver reactive testing at the moment, where you do a blood test, data's not really available to the patient, not available in the future, and we chose a turnaround time of 20 days, you have an uptake of around 50% for that test. If you use an optimized service where patients have access to their own data, where you're reusing that data over time and maybe use a non-invasive approach, that uptake goes well above 95%. And then we're able to do things called willingness to wait. So people are willing to wait longer for their results if you deliver a good service to them. And critically, what we found is that people will wait 10 days longer to get that result if they have access to their own data, ideally via an online portal, and if the data is reused over time. And people wanted non-invasive methods. But what we know is that the population is not a kind of homogeneous entity. There is huge heterogeneity within the population. And we undertook something called latent class analysis, which allows you to understand whether there's different preferences in different groups within the population. And what we found was that there were 4 core groups within the population as it broke down. And we found that around 4% of the population, no matter how good you made that service, they did not want genomic testing. They did not want pharmacogenomic testing. But the remaining 96, they were variably sensitive to how you designed that service. And class 1 were a group of around 30% of the population who really wanted that data reused in the population. And so if you said the data's not reused, they didn't want the service. If you said it is reused, they were more likely to take it up. The biggest predictor of whether patients chose to have pharmacogenetic testing was whether you gave them access to your data. And around 50% of the population, class 2, wanted access to the data. If you didn't give it them, they didn't want that test. So great, we've done a discrete choice experiment. Who cares? What are we actually going to do with that information? And we've taken the findings from this and we've already embedded it within our design of the phase 2 of the progress study. So in phase 1, we took blood samples, we did that in person, but actually in phase 2 we now have non-invasive sampling approaches that patients can do at home. We have an interoperable data solution, which Bill has already mentioned, with reuse of the data, and we're trying to make data available to patients, and we've now built that in to the study protocol based on this very clear feedback from our public stakeholders. And also, we've created a nice app. So if you want to have a play around developing your own pharmacogenetic service and see how good you can get it, then follow this QR code and you can have a play around, and that takes the raw data from our file, and yeah, you can see what you can do with that. So this has already been used by some health services who we work with around the world, who have found it really, really useful to see how those design decisions really do change how a service might be used. So I am not, as you can probably tell, a health economist. I am incredibly grateful to Catherine Payne, who's here today, and Stuart Wright, who's supported me throughout this programme. Both of these, so the work on the patient views has been published, as have the work on healthcare professionals, which we didn't touch on today, and you can follow them via that QR code. But I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
So much. I just have to ask you though, what is, I wrote it down, a hedonic pricing method? Is that about very fancy, that you're, with running shoes, you're so kind of dazzled by the cost of the shoes that you just buy?
Address questions like that to Catherine Payne, who's
Quickly,
give a much
what's
more
a hedonic pricing method? You see, they make it up as they go along, don't they? Tell you what, we're intrigued. We want to know about the hedonic pricing method because it sounds good. It's the kind of the Prada of the health economics. Right. Okay, let's now move on to Dr. Emma McGovern. Emma is a MRC clinician scientist and a lecturer in clinical pharmacology at QMUL, and I've been delighted that I've been able to work with her to do a survey on attitudes to pharmacogenomics. And could I just say, if there's anybody in the house, she has come here, even though she might suddenly have to dash around. She's come with her records.
All right, thanks so much, Viv, and lovely to see you all here today. It's wonderful about pharmacogenomics, that it's such a fantastic community that works so well together, and that's really a real pleasure for those of us that get to work in this team. So to follow on the wonderful talks we've heard so far about the work that's been done within this fantastic network to include patients and the public voice in every step of what we do within pharmacogenomics and designing a fit-for-purpose service in the NHS. We all know about the promises of personalised prescribing in terms of safety, efficacy. We can have a good debate with the health psychologists about adherence, compliance, whatever you want to call it, which none of us can really answer so far. But there's lots of benefits. But to get there, really we have to go from evidence-based and controlled settings to practice. And when we talk about that step, actually I think the whole set of concerns become really, really different and hard to understand without talking to those who are actually the ones involved, which is our patients and the public. So what we wanted to do was reach out at scale to a representative sample of UK adults. And we had the really great fortune, thanks to funding from the NHS England network and from Genomics England via Vivian's team and the public engagement panel, to work with the National Centre for Social Science. They go by NatCen. So if you've ever heard of sort of any of the surveys in BBC that I presented as to sort of what the public thinks about the monarchy or how much TV people watch or something like that, it's normally NatCen and their opinion panel, because they've done a really brilliant job of getting cross-sectional views from a representative version of the population of UK adults across the 4 nations and across a huge number of really staggering number of demographics. So we worked with them to collect some data around people's opinion of pharmacogenomics last summer, and we had the good success to have a 58% response rate and collect over 2,700 responses. So how did we design these questions? So we had a really wonderful collaboration from many of these people who are here today, working with the NHS England Network of Excellence that's hosting this fantastic event, all of those within Bill's team, the Genomics England panel led by Viv Parry, health psychologists, so I saw Alison here today, maybe John as well from King's, and then the NatCen team are really experts in fine-honing these questions and formats so that you're asking sort of unbiased, well-balanced questions and making them accessible to people, which is really helpful. So they got opinions reaching out to 4,700 people within their opinion panels, and we got that 58% response rate, leading us to just under 3,000 responses, to which we applied weighting so that we can say fairly that these views are representative of a cross-section of the UK adult population. And this gives us a basis to move forward in terms of fit-for-service pharmacogenomics and public opinion. So what do people think? Well, first of all, people really understand variability in medication response. And I think lots of us have had these conversations, so maybe that's intuitive. But it's nice to see. The other thing to say is that the majority of people do feel that they've had experience with either medicine ineffectiveness or an adverse drug reaction. But if you start asking, well, what do you think the role of DNA is in that? People are substantially less sure. About half of people will say, oh, yeah, maybe DNA has something to do with it. And about half will just really say, I don't know. So why would people want to undertake a pharmacogenomics test? I think this was really quite informative. I think bottom line message here is that nearly 9 in 10 people, for at least one of these reasons, would choose to take a pharmacogenomics test. And if you have them prioritize their motivation, then the strongest factor is really effectiveness of their medicine. People really want that medicine to work for them. And that's followed by not wanting to have a side effect, not wanting to have a bad reaction, but actually is secondary. And the health psychologists could have told us this, and in fact they did tell us this. They said, you doctors, you're all fixated on side effects, but actually patients are much more centered on effectiveness. I think that was Alison who's here today, and she was spot on. So they already knew this, but it's nice to see. So the question of medication adherence is really interesting. I think we heard from Lucy at one of the last meetings about the conflicting evidence in the literature around the possibility for personalized prescribing using genetic variants to impact on adherence, which those of us who prescribe know is a real worry. A medicine doesn't do anything for someone if they don't take it. And that's about 50% non-adherence, for example, in the realm of hypertension. So does this hold an answer potentially? And obviously one aspect is people's opinion, because they may do something different from what they say. But nearly 70% of people did feel their adherence would increase if they knew that a medicine had been personalized using their genetic information. Now, how do people feel about incorporation of such a service within the NHS? And granted, this is a time when, of course, people are feeling quite worried about strain on the NHS. So I think it's really quite striking that 85% of UK adults felt that pharmacogenomics should be offered to that highest risk population who have lots of medical morbidities and are taking multiple medicines. Now, slightly less strong opinions, but still over half of people at 65% thinking that actually it would be suitable for the NHS to offer this service to everyone. Now, we didn't ask people about prioritising economic sort of options and opportunity costs, so caveat there, but still a resounding support for incorporation within our national health system. Following on from what we've just heard from John, and Viv and her team, I think, will speak to this as well, but 91% of people wanted access to their own pharmacogenomic results. And I think across the board, we've seen that people feel really strongly about their ownership of their data and gating that themselves and holding that themselves. And that's really important takeaway message, I think, for what we can do. Now, I think it's really important also to ask people what their concerns may be, what might be worries, what might we need to put in place to protect this data if there's anything that people are worried could go wrong. So first, a quite simple question, and we saw that a pretty good percentage, actually, 64% were not at all worried about having a pharmacogenomic test, and a quarter just a little bit. So only 12% were actually even substantially worried potentially about this, but that was quite a simple question. So then we tried something else. We said, what are your worries across an array of ways that data could be used from pharmacogenomics? And what are your concerns as they would relate to general medical data? So a scan or a blood test in terms of identifying who you are, identifying what ancestry group you come from, potential requests from police to access that data, family structure. And then we asked with regard to pharmacogenomics, and the thing to note about these is that they're superimposable almost. People felt almost exactly the same way in terms of concerns about data in these areas across groups. Now, even though these distributions look almost the same, there are 3 areas where there were 1 to 2 to 3% more concern. And those were around things which are, I think, quite valid concerns if we do population-level genetic testing, let's say, not an individual genetic testing or one person in, 1,000 or something. People were a little more worried about ancestry being worked out, a little bit worried about family structure being worked out, so a little bit more concerned about identification of population and family structure, and a little bit worried about potential police requests for this data. But other than that, distribution totally equal, and actually people were more concerned about non-pharmacogenomic data for the other categories. Now, this thing about data sharing and what that means and what people are worried about, we've seen across the board in studies that people are pretty happy for pharmacogenomics to be shared across healthcare settings, to most extent with researchers, definitely with regulators, people feel quite confident. But the takeaway here is that only 10% of people were comfortable with this data being shared with private commercial entities. And that is really important, because if that's the starting point, then actually probably we need something prospectively in there that means people have control over that aspect, or we could end up with 90% quite unhappy people. So quite an important take-home message there. Now, informed consent has been an interesting topic around pharmacogenomics. This is not diagnostic genetic testing. We're using it to optimize medicines use. Again, if we do it one patient, one doctor, there's no other data there. It's only on a population level that it would ever be different from kidney function tests or liver function tests. But how do we manage that? What do people need to know? So right now, there's no minimum sort of criteria applied. So we asked how people felt about 4 basic things. Did they need to be told this was genetic testing? Did they need to be told that the purpose was to make medicines safer and more effective? And did they need to be told that actually, even if their medicines were personalized, they could still have a side effect, or they could still have a medicine that didn't work well for them? And actually, people felt pretty importantly that all of those were very important. Or at least fairly important. So I think they've given us a bit of a minimum criteria for things that actually the representative public of our country think do need to be included in a discussion. Now, we wanted to ask people about pharmacovigilance, because an important aspect of personalized prescribing is how we interface with genetic signals, underlying adverse drug reactions, and then how we can build that into a holistic system where we're doing clinical pharmacogenomics. So we started out with some awareness questions. So only about a quarter of the population were aware of yellow card reporting, which is our national pharmacovigilance system reporting for adverse drug reactions. But of those people who were, the vast majority, 88%, did know that anyone can make a report. So patients, carers, the public, that it's not just healthcare professionals that can file a report. But really critically, that was an underpinning for this question, which is, do people want pharmacogenomic information included in pharmacovigilance reporting. In an ideal world, right, we do this clinically. We include potentially some more variants that can be useful to identify genomic underpinning of new adverse drug reactions, which is the point of the pilot project, the Yellow Card Biobank at the moment. And then when you send an adverse drug reaction, it's all seamless, right? Your medicines are in an NHS app, your genetics are in an NHS app, you have a bad reaction, goes to the MHRA along with all of that. And there was resounding support for that. So 70% of people wanted to be able to include that data in a report for adverse drug reaction. And there was more support in that for people who already knew about yellow card reporting in the MHRA. So that means actually perhaps if people were more aware of pharmacovigilance systems, there would be even more support for that. So overall, what did we get from this survey? We got an understanding that people really deeply understand variability in medicine response, that there's a lot of support for pharmacogenomic testing, particularly in those that are highest at risk, that people really probably will want to take pharmacogenomic tests up on scale, and that there's not substantially greater concerns actually across the board, but there are some particular areas that we should probably pay attention to. And I think one of those is patient gating of access to information for data sharing, particularly around private financial entities. And that's something that's come up again and again and again, and I think we should probably heed that. The other thing is concerns about identification of population, family level structure, and potential police requests. If we start doing pharmacogenomic panels at scale for an entire population, it's hard to believe that at some point forensics wouldn't have an interest in that. And if it's already something people are a bit concerned about, do we need some sort of a policy firewall there? I think these are questions that probably should be asked quite early. Lastly, I didn't show this graph, but there was a lack of available patient information. So over 95% of people had never heard of anywhere that they could get any of this information. So that's really important. We need the funds and the proper dedication to make these patient resources. And they've given us a minimum criteria to include for informed consent. Lastly, there's a lot of support for inclusion of pharmacogenomics and pharmacovigilance. So I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who participated. So all the authors in the study, many of whom are here today. So we had the Network of Excellence team, the Health Psychology team, the NatSen, Viv Perry and her team, and the funders who made this work possible, which are the NHS England team and Genomics England for their contributions. And really the point is to get this right for the patients. So thank you very much.
Things that we take away from that is a definitive study. Enough already about attitude. Enough already. It's now that we move to implementation, because this is a really big study, lots of information, and we're going to discuss it a bit more in our session in a moment. So thank you very much. Now let's move to Dr. Vidya Sharma, Clinical Innovation Lead at the University of Manchester.
Thank you. Thank you, Viv. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here and great to see many familiar and lots of new faces as well. We hadn't planned this, but it appears that our presentations are following each other really, really nicely. I'm going to talk not about anything controversial, but those of you that know me do like, I like to challenge myself and challenge everybody that I speak to about the ways we think and the ways we work. And following on from what Viv just said, when I think about PPIE, particularly in the context of pharmacogenomics and personalized prescribing, one of the things that I've realized is that we know a lot. We know there is lots of evidence out there about support for pharmacogenomics. People understand it, people get it. I loved your 3 words, Viv, why wouldn't you? And I think that's something that we need to be aware of. Do we need to be doing more PPIE? Or do we need to be thinking beyond PPIE? This is just a really quick search of all the types of research that's out there, both looking at public preferences as well as healthcare professional preferences around pharmacogenomics. So we know that there is strong support. We have a good understanding of what are effective service models, as John's described. What are the attributes of a particular service that would drive uptake? That could be the method of testing. That could be the way the data is used. It could be around the way the data is shared. And we know that at a large scale. So I really want us to try to think about what happens in other industries when people have got a product or a service that there is a demand for. how do they move from understanding what people's preferences are to implementation? How do they move from an idea or a concept to product and services that people use on a regular basis? And the challenge that I want to pose to ourselves is around this concept that if we want to move into a world where we are more thinking about products and services, we need to move beyond PPIE. And PPIE is often extractive, so it is a kind of a one-way conversation. We're trying to get something from the people that we are engaging with, rather than collaborative, where we're working together to come up with solutions. Patients are involved, but they are not necessarily embedded within our projects. We engage with them at certain time points, the start, a quarter of the way through, 3/4 of the way through, and perhaps at the end. Often we don't go back at the end and give them feedback of how we've incorporated their suggestions throughout the course of the project, even though we often do. That is something that I often hear from patients and public members that I've involved in projects. They say, this was great, but whatever happened to that project? So in order to move towards a more, I suppose, contemporary mindset, one of the things that I often reflect about is to have a more of a user-centered design approach. And I've talked about user-centered design often, and you may have heard me talk about that before, but that's really about changing the way we think about engagement. And that's about it being more ongoing, about building trust and feedback, that we will come back to you to tell you what we've changed based on what you've told us, and a real focus on application and usability. So rather than it being theoretical, rather than we take these ideas and this feedback from our engagement work, we actually go and apply that, as John has described, as we've done during the progress study, where we've taken some of those findings of the discrete choice experiment and then gone and implemented changes, which then people can see. And in theory, if of course the theory follows the practice, that is going to drive uptake. So it's not just beneficial for people in the public that we engage with that we should be doing this, it's beneficial for us. That's the point that we're doing PPIE, is because we want to deliver better services. And the phrase that often is used to encompass that is this idea of moving away from designing for users to designing with users. And I think this is a general shift in healthcare, as healthcare becomes more user-focused, as we increasingly do more PPI, and we start to embrace the fact that we need to be collaborative and we need to think about what it is that people want as we want to drive better health outcomes. And that's really, really important. So this is just one of the ways that we could reframe how we think about PPIE. One of the terms that I heard someone mention at a user experience conference was that advocate for your users at all times. As opposed to engaging with them at different time points, we should at all times be thinking, is this useful? Whether that's for the patient or whether that's for the healthcare professional. And John said that beautifully in his talk as well. If it's not useful, it will not be used. The reason we all use our smartphones or use various tools or a piece of technology regularly is because they are useful, and they are useful and they're usable. And that is the type of mindset that we, I think, would benefit from adopting, not just in genomics and pharmacogenomics, but in healthcare generally. It's something that I don't see us doing well enough. So how do you do that in practice? And I've got a list of some practical points in a moment, but first, there needs to be a plan, there needs to be a strategy of how we move from more segmented, isolated PPIE approach to perhaps a more user-centered, user advocacy approach. And that's firstly to think about resources and budgeting. So budgeting for design, not just comms and engagement, not just individual sections of engagement. Have that space for iteration, as John has highlighted. So when you do get feedback, let's go and implement that feedback. Let that not just be something that we've gathered and we've written in a report. Let's go and apply it so we can see the impact of that in the real world. Patient involvement that's paid, ongoing, and bidirectional. This is something that I do not think we always do. We often pay our participants. That's fantastic. We don't often maintain a relationship with them, whether that's a postal relationship or a digital relationship. It isn't always bidirectional. We go out to them to say, hey, can you come and do a workshop and we'll ask you a bunch of questions? Rarely do we have a way for them to access us, to say, hey, actually, I saw something on the news that I think might be relevant. Can I tell you about it? And governance and leadership that values not just patient involvement and engagement, but usability and adoption. which are the steps where actually impact takes place. I think one of the examples where I've seen this happen well is the partisan panel at Genomics England, which Viv has led for several years, where some of these elements are certainly part of the way that is set up. And this is one of the quotes that I really quite like when people often think about design or they think about how something looks, and that is really what the job of design is. But it isn't. Design isn't about how something looks, it's about how something works. I don't know if anybody knows who this quote is by. No? No takers? It's Steve Jobs, so the founder of Apple. And I think that's a really important message and a really, really important way to think. And this is certainly something that I have adopted as I try to work in innovation. Okay, so for the last minute or so, let's talk about how do we do this in practice then. So how do we move beyond PPIE? So some practical suggestions, and very happy for people to give me feedback on any of these, right? These are some of my ideas and learnings. I might be completely wrong and you might completely disagree. I hope you do. That's the whole point of me presenting this. But moving towards this more co-design rather than consultative relationship, I think is a first place to start, and that's what we did during the Progress trial. So we worked together with primary care practitioners, both GPs and pharmacists. We went out to their clinics, we had virtual meetings with them, and we talked them through, we want to do pharmacogenomics, we want to present this information to you, what would that look like? And that is where we started. We didn't start with the technology, we didn't start with the data, we started with the users. And that allowed us to understand that, gosh, this is the only way this is going to work is if this is part of their existing clinical systems, which now seems very obvious, but you've not uncovered that unless you go and do that work. If it's part of their existing clinical systems and if it's part of their workflows. And that's what was the impetus for Progress RX and all the digital strategy and all the data and everything that we've developed subsequently. We started with the users and we worked together with them to design that. We brought in design skills within the team, whether that was through external contracting or actually bringing in teams from within the university. And we worked with service designers, we've worked with user experience designers, user researchers, a whole group of not healthcare professionals, a whole group of professionals working in healthcare that are not doctors, nurses, etc., but who bring really, really valuable additional skills. We design artifacts to drive conversations. So we draw pictures, we make prototypes, we design screens of what might this actually look like. And one of the common phrases that I really liked is, you will all have heard of a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. And that is something that is really, really true. So we, by presenting something visual to people, allowing them to click through something, allowing them to have that experience, you get such rich feedback, a lot more than you can just have from a conversation. We've tried to create patients and clinical advocates. So when there are people that are clearly early adopters, enthusiasts, we've tried to maintain a relationship with them. We've tried to continue to engage them when we can. And I think as part of that, it's fantastic to have Mark here today, who's going to speak after me, as a patient representative, someone who is part of a community or part of a group that from within can say, this is something that is beneficial, or this is good about it, this is bad about it. That allows the rest of the community to come along with it. And this final piece around building feedback into infrastructure. So I think one of the things that we are trying to do more of is be more accessible to our Progress participants, for them to be able to get back in touch with us at different time points to ask questions. So we have that ongoing bi-directional relationship with them. And I think that's something that we can maybe do more easily, whether that's email addresses, whether that's a phone number. And not many people will get in touch, but allowing that accessibility makes us look a lot more compassionate and a lot more open. Fantastic. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that was useful and a little bit thought-provoking, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So, and now, where is he? Mark Joseph Rapper, we're delighted to have you with us. Patient, you've been working with this team, so do...
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Andres of the team for having me here and for inviting me to be part of the workshops which we organized. In the... Ooh, there we go. There we go. What I want to go through is how I got involved in the study, what happened when I got the results and some thoughts which I had after participating. Because most of the thinking process as a patient, the thinking which I've done was after the effect. It wasn't during the consultation which I had with my clinician. So I enrolled in the trial in November 2023. It was through my GP, and my story, I think, is very probably similar to many people. Is previously I was on SSRIs and did really well, but I gained a lovely whopping 20 kilos, which I worked really hard to lose. A few months later, I needed to go back on SSRIs. I knew that I should have been on them for a few weeks already. So for me, the sense of urgency was ever present. But also there was a great hesitancy in that I don't want to gain that weight again. So my very lovely GP at the time said, well, there is this trial and we will find out. And I remember interrupting her and I said, when would I get my results? It didn't matter to me as a patient at that point how the tests will be done, who is going to be affected. I just wanted my results, if possible within the next hour. It wasn't, but it wasn't very far either. So the process, she explained what pharmacogenomics is and how it will work. I will get a testing kit from the reception and someone will call me to take my consent over the phone and explain the entire process. So the consultation wasn't longer than usual. Yes, there was a bit of computer hiccups into how to navigate the system, how we get you the right nurse to give you the right kit. But went home, read the information sheet, lots of words, but very understandable. I did think a video would be really good in this instance. And I remember Googling online and I finding information about the progress study, but at the time, I couldn't find a video. There are many videos online now, so if you're interested, there are many, many videos, which are really great. And there was the testing kit. It was quite a straightforward test. You just spit into a tube, and then you had the option to either post it or you drop it off at the surgery. That was very convenient. I lived close to the surgery, but for someone else, having the option of just dropping it off into the post, that is brilliant, because you don't have to go back to the surgery. And on the consent process, we had a lovely chat over the phone. They explained what was expected of me, how it will work out, when should I expect the results. But again, my focus was also, when will I get the results? Can I get this within the next 5 days? And throughout, I should have mentioned that was 31st October when I actually enrolled on the study. And it's important to remember that date. And I remember asking the person on the phone, so when will I get the results? And they said, in 2-3 weeks, you will get the results. But all along, and this is what I think made me even more go on the trial, is that the GP said, so these are the options. So we can either go on sertraline or we can wait for the results to come out. I was given the option. My views, my concerns about the anxieties about delaying another week or two were appeased a bit knowing that I've had that option. And they said, you can either start these now and we reevaluate when we get the results, or you can wait. So it was all about building the trust with my clinician, and I decided to wait. Later on, I was involved in the workshops with Vidya and the other team, and it was really interesting because there were 2 separate workshops, not 1, 2. And why wasn't important it was 2? Because we focused on different parts of the study. So the before and the after. Because for each of us, we may muddle them both together, but separately they're very important. So how did I find out I got the results? My lovely GP sent me a message. Your results are in. And I'm like, brilliant. So what do we do now? We had already organized a follow-up consultation. So my GP in the first appointment said, you know what, let's schedule an appointment for the next few days. And by that point, if you have the results, we'll go with that result. If not, we'll go on the sertraline on the first line. And again, this is giving me the reassurance that there are options available, that I'm not being left to decide by myself, but it's a shared decision which we are making together. And then I received a text message, results are available, brilliant. Go to the consultation, and I was prescribed a drug which had the least adverse effects, which was going to work better for me than any other drugs. And I was sent away with the prescription. Brilliant, fantastic. And I've pressed the wrong button, brilliant. That took 9 days. So that took merely 9 days, 31st October, 13th November, it was my birthday, that's why I remember. It took just 9 days for this entire process, okay? And again, I want to emphasize my importance that it wasn't how this is gonna work out, it's when am I gonna get my results. Went home, and so what do I do now? So I've got this information, I've got this knowledge, but I want to read more about it. What do I do? What adverse effects was she actually talking about? I don't actually know. I just said yes because I wanted to get better. I want to get better faster, but also I can't expect my clinician within 6 to 8 minutes to explain what that actually means. So if I were sent away with some information, I could do that myself. And yes, we spoke about adverse events, the effects, but which ones were they? And for example, I've discussed this with a friend of mine, and we spoke about the weight gain and the SSRIs. And they said, well, actually, if someone said, I take SSRIs and I gain 5 kilos, which I've been trying to gain for the last 5 years, I'd be very happy. I wouldn't be happy with that. So there are adverse events which for some patients, they're happy to tolerate. Others are not. And I think that is why it is important to have an explanation of what adverse events are and how they affect each individual. The GP's concerns about the adverse events would be different than mine. And that is why the shared discussion is made. But is there enough time to have that discussion? Probably not. But there are ways we can manage that. If I had the access to my results online, if I could access and I have this nice chart of telling me these are the drugs and these are the effects which you may or may not have, and this is the level of severity, then I could go to ChatGPT, I could go on the internet and start Googling. But I'm Googling after the fact that I have some information already. If I were to Google any of the SSRIs, you'll have the same list of side effects, some worse than others, but it's not the personalized information. Whereas if I have a list of the drugs and I have a list of the severity, then that might lead me to make a better informed decision about what treatments I want to get on. So some would say that having access to the results will cause patients more anxiety. In my case, because I can only speak from my experience, that wasn't the case. It was actually the other way around, that I know that there is some information somewhere about me, but which could help me make future decisions, but it's not available to me. And if it's not available to me, what is the point of doing the test? And if this were part of routine healthcare, what if the test is immediately available to everyone? And that is immediately incorporated within something like the NHS app or any other way I could be a better advocate for my health. And this is where I wanted to get to. So I moved GPs, as most of us probably do. You move from place to place. I live in Manchester. Wherever your catchment is, you have a different GP. And I wanted to change my SSRIs. We tried to find the data. We couldn't find it on the system. So what happened then is my decision to go on the next SSRIs wasn't an informed decision. We're so much concerned about the informed consent at the beginning of the process. that we forget sometimes that later decisions are affected by information which the NHS may hold, which the GP practice may hold, but I don't hold. If I were to move countries, if I were to happen to be abroad and I need to go on statins or something or another, I don't have that data. And why shouldn't I have that data? If it is about me and it is, at the end of the day, helping me and saving costs, then why shouldn't it be the case? There is also a question about the language which we're using. I want to make 2 points about the language. So we speak about adverse events, which can trigger some people. I'm like, okay, this is going to be a bad thing. This is going to, all the negative side effects. But what if we reframe the language into, let's look at what treatment is better for you, rather than the least effective. Let's change the negative to a positive. Which treatment is better, is best for you? Because that gives the individual less anxieties and less likely to go online and use those same words. Because those same words will trigger lists of probably you're gonna die. And we hear a lot about the importance of, if you look online and you read about the benefits of personalized medicine, one of the key things which comes at the very top usually is saving the NHS money. It's great, important, we all want to save the NHS money, but usually the patient empowerment comes towards the end. But if we are to reframe that language and starting from the point of, we've got this brilliant tool, and this brilliant tool will empower the patient, will give you the information to make better decisions about yourself and about your healthcare. And by the way, this will save the NHS some money. When I hear about saving the NHS money, the first thing I think about is not better healthcare, but cost cutting. If I want to save money, I have to stop spending money elsewhere, which is not what I as a patient feel confident to hear. So if we rephrase the language into it being a more positive, what is the better treatment for you? And here the NHS, this hospital, this trust, is looking at this study to make you feel empowered to make these decisions, not just today, but you can carry these decisions with you in your pocket, and wherever you go, you can advocate for your own healthcare. And the last slide is, one of the workshops, there were concerns about how are GPs going to do this within the 6 or 8 minutes framework. We simply do not have the time to go through all this. I get it. And that is why, going back, sending the patients with information makes things much easier. Also, the patient is not thinking the way you're thinking. We generally don't care about the letters or the numbers or the graphs. We can't understand them. All I want to hear is about what treatment is going to make me feel better, which information I can understand, and where can I find it. And we already do that in that GPs send you the information via text, they send you links to read at home, and if you have someone who wants to understand the science, then you link them to the study if you want to. So whilst there are anxieties about the time not being long enough, it's about using the resources wisely. We don't need to go into great detail what this test is going to do. For me, it is sufficient to hear, look, there are these options, but we can find out which is the better one by doing this test. You will get this test within 9 working days. Are you willing to wait? If not, we can start on this treatment. And if you're willing to wait, then let's re-adjourn in 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, you don't have to have an in-person consultation because you've already done that. You've sent the patient with information at home. So then it can just be a telephone conversation. Look, the results are in. These are the medications which are better for you. What do you want to go ahead with? And the last slide which I have, what is the aim around all this? When I think about it from outside is we want better treatment and we want to go less to the GPs. why would you want to go to GP if you can do this in any other way? And we want to save money for ourselves. We're still paying for the prescription, however low the cost is. But for some people, $9.90 a month on medication which is not working for them is quite high. And we want to save our health. Why would I spend 2-3 months having adverse effects when I know I can have better health without those side effects? And we want to save the NHS. So what do we need? We need access, and we need accessibility. So the language which we are using, where you pick up the tests, where you drop off the tests. The language which we are using, reframing the texts into a patient-centered, and then the cost comes later. Also that we rephrase the adverse effects into which medication is better for you. And reassurance. Healthcare clinicians have a very difficult job in reassuring people, especially anxious young people who want to go on SSRIs now and they need to work by this evening because I want to be feeling like a fresh person by tomorrow morning. So giving that reassurance is very hard, it's very difficult, but it is manageable. If we do all that, what we would get is shared decision making, because we are empowering people with the right language and reassuring them and giving them access to information. We are building trust in clinicians and technology. Some of the hesitancy which people may have is because they don't trust clinicians. And trust in technology, so who owns the data, for example, may be a bigger question, but it may only interest a small demographic of people. We will get better outcome, and we would save the NHS money, and we would save the NHS. Thank you very much.
That was fab. Do take a seat. That was terrific, and you are so singing my song. And I take away from that, again, in a short, pithy phrase in my tabloid journalist way, is don't make a mountain out of a molehill, folks. You know, simple works better. And if you over-engineer things and make it too complicated, then actually you'll drive people away. Quickly, can we have our panel back? The other Emma, how long can I munch of coffee time?
Sort of now-ish.
Yes.
We can defer because
Yes.
this is good.
Yes. All right. Thank goodness he said that.
Have less time having coffee, that's all right.
Am I allowed? That wasn't a very enthusiastic. But, okay. So, oh, God, there are so many questions okay, John, are you worried that if we overhype pharmacogenomics, which incidentally we cannot call pharmacogenomics to the general public, they can't say it, but if we overhype it, then what we'll get is we'll get people believing that it's all about adverse effects, are all about genomics, and they don't have to read the label.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that pharmacogenomics has major promise to be able to improve health outcomes for individuals and for health systems, but it is not independently a silver bullet. And I think it's about explaining that this is predictive, but it's not perfectly predictive. And actually, it's about how you embed that with other biomarkers. So if a patient's on lots of medicines, then actually that might interact with your pharmacogenomic results. And it's about getting patients to take their medicines as well. So pharmacogenomics is a tool. It's a really useful tool, but it cannot be the only tool in our armory. And what we need to do is to develop more sophisticated ways of implementing this within a service.
Yeah, so the fact that when I went out the night I got my final results and I'd had antihistamines because I had a big bee sting that day, the fact that I drank pina coladas all night was all the reason for my adverse effects and not at all anything else. Emma, how far, we've said boldly that we think that's enough already, that is the definitive piece of work on attitude. What do we need to do next in terms of attitude? Is it about now implementation and what people think about implementation and how to do it?
I think taking people's opinion and doing what they've said, essentially. So I think we've had, and then heard really nicely from you as well, the need to have really accessible patient information that's proportionate, that it filters down the huge amount of information out there in a way that's reasonable, and that's really important. So I think we need that patient information, and I think also we need to listen to people's concerns. I think we've heard across the board concerns about scaled data and this level ending up being shared with private sort of financially driven entities. And potentially there's some aspect of that where, patient consultations with policy need to create some policies, for example, firewalls, gating of information, which is led by patients that's specific to that type of information, that actually is unique. It doesn't apply to your liver function test or your kidney function test, and it doesn't apply to rare disease testing and genetics. So I think we really need to just follow the patient and essentially do what they've told us.
Do any of you know Partha Kar in here? So Partha Kar is a clinical lead for type 1 diabetes in the NHS. And he decided to take on improving access to closed-loop systems for type 1 diabetics. And only 3% had them at the beginning of his reign, and it was 97% by the end. And the reason, if you go to him and say, oh, it must have been about money, did he discover a gold mine under NHS England, under Skipton House? And he said it wasn't about that at all. What it was about was actually patient advocacy, because his reduction of the NHS was 30% of people in the NHS are early adopters, 30% will just put their heads down and do things, and then finally there are 30% who think, I will only do what I want to do and don't you dare bloody tell me what to do. But actually, it was patients that made the difference, because they marched along and they said, everybody else is getting this, why aren't I? And that patient advocacy became a huge force. And you mentioned it, Vid, and I wanted to ask Mark what you thought about patients being advocates and champions for pharmacogenomics.
I think it is possible, and I think the fact that I am here as well is already an indication that we want to get patients on board. I think how can patients be champions for pharmacogenomics is by making the information widely available, but it's also word of mouth.
Yes.
So it's when you have people who are on statins who come together, or if I'm on SSRIs, I was telling my friends, like, I've done this study, and this is why I know that this drug is great for me, and this is not so great for me. So that is how you would build the advocacy. And it's more a bottom-top approach rather than going to publishing information on the website, for example. We were thinking yesterday, like, what would work is going on to the Good Morning show, for example. A 5-10 minute segment, this is happening, and this is what you could actually benefit from it, and then how you would do it.
Yeah, but also it's having something on your phone. You say having the data yourself. So if you have an app on your phone, oh, hello, John. Having an app on your phone, and you can show your friend in the pub and say, oh, look, I did this, have you seen? I mean, we're always saying to each other, have you seen this app, or why don't you get this? And we could do the same for pharmacogenomics, and it'd be an organic movement for change, which comes from patients.
And I think younger people, there is, obviously my experience is of a younger person, younger white person. So there are other demographics which are not even in the room probably, who might have a different experience. But the experience of a younger person is important because I think it drives the change. And I think we are more open about our healthcare, about the way we feel and the way we think. So I think having that study and that option available and the information available to younger people can drive change maybe even faster within some areas.
John, we definitely know there is a pent-up patient demand, and so last year after NICE made the recommendation that all patients who've had a stroke or TIA should have CYP2C19 genotyping, it was round BBC News and a number of other news organisations. We had a large number of calls over the next month from GPs and from patients getting in touch with us asking, well, can we have testing for this? And people want access to this testing because it's a simple message that actually we can do a test to determine how you're going to respond to your medicine.
Now, the worst thing that could happen with pharmacogenomics is that, I've got my stuff, I've got my app, I go to a GP and I say, cop a load of this. as you do to your GP, and or pharmacist, and the GP just blanks you and says, "Don't know anything about this," and also we've kind of created an environment in genetics where there are all sorts of commercial tests, which are rubbish. And people go into the GP. So GPs have been conditioned, I think, not to accept the person that comes in and says, "Look at this genetic testing." So how do we persuade GPs? How do patients help persuade GPs that this is genuine, proper stuff and not some nonsense off the internet?
I think there's two elements to that. So we work a lot with GPs, and it's great to see some GPs in the room, even here today. So the fact that we're trying to engage that community actively, I think is the first step. But I think there's two practical things that we've heard are important. So I think firstly, if it is an independent app or it is a separate place where this data is being made available because of a lack of integration, etc., is there some kind of accreditation, NHS approval
A kind
system?
of an NHS wrapper.
That's right.
Yeah.
So does it have a stamp on it? I think that drives trust significantly. The other thing is that it needs to be really easy. So if you are wanting to give this information to your GP outside of the existing NHS infrastructure, does your app have a button to say, share with GP, what's your email address, GP, click, and then it goes to the GP in their inbox and they have access to your information in a GP-friendly way, not in a genetics-friendly way, because just as much as the language we're talking about communicating with patients, primary care colleagues are the same. They are not genetic experts, so the language that we use there, again, needs to follow much closer to what we use when we speak to patients, and that's where that information is available. And really simple features, so people don't want long reports of like all the medicines that someone could, like Ron's picture with, that's not what GPs want. What the GPs want,
Traffic lights. This.
They want.
Don't.
They want to. What they want
think about it.
They want a search bar.
Okay.
They want a search bar. They want a Google. They want sertraline, green, red, delete, tricyclic antidepressant, enter. That's what they want.
Yeah.
So it's about designing things that are really usable, that are similar to how we use other services, and do not give people information overload.
And one thing we haven't discussed today is pharmacists. How many pharmacists have we got in the audience? You see, I think you're super important in all of this. I want you to be super important in all of this because, why can't a patient show their data to a pharmacist and say, what do you think? And pharmacists now have the ability to change medicines, don't they, without going back to the GP, within the same class? Oh, no. Okay. All right, then. I'll go quietly. I'm going to take one or... John.
Vivian, I'd like to direct a question to Emma. I'm John Byrne, Professor of Clinical Genetics, and I chair the Research and Innovation team. And Emma Groves is one of the members of that team, along with Steve, who's behind me. And she asked the question, which I've been wrestling with, why don't we just test the mothers instead of testing the babies for the gentamicin sensitivity? So, Emma, you had a pharmacogenomic test called your blood groups. Okay, you were blood grouped. You probably didn't have to give consent for that, but when you're pregnant, so you have to be blood grouped. And I've been wondering why you said why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So essentially, why don't we just get the blood group team to do the R1, R1 test on every pregnant woman? That's 600,000 at a stroke. I don't think we actually probably need consent for that. We don't take consent for blood grouping. We just sort of put on your file your blood group A positive and don't give this lady or her offspring gentamicin. I know, I'm sorry, John, it kind of puts Jean right on it. But I have to declare an interest since I chair a competing biotech company making point-of-care devices. But that's not why I'm saying it. I mean, I just think that anything that would replace point-of-care, I think John would agree, anything that could get it industrialized at massively low cost and done across the board, and no one would complain.
No, we're waiting for people to be sick, aren't we? And you want to do preemptive testing.
Why don't we just do that?
So I think it's an amazing point, especially when you talk about mitochondrial inheritance, because it's such a clear pattern. And I've been working with the G2MC to lead a separate group of the family history to look at how pharmacogenomics could be better integrated with family history, because we've kept them in separate silos in ways that don't make a lot of sense, actually. I guess they're simple. If you're testing the mom exclusively for the value of finding out about the kids, and then you're testing all of them. I mean, that would be a lot more than babies that end up in NICU. So I guess, you know, that would be a lot of money that, you know, the babies aren't going to have an indication for the drug in the first instance, most of them, and some of them could very well go many, many, many years without ever getting an aminoglycoside. So I guess that would be the only contra. But I agree with you that I think family history and approach to things, as testing becomes cheaper and cheaper, becomes more and more attractive. And I think there's more basic questions even around that, which is, I'm a general medic. I walk around prescribing aminoglycosides to sick people all the time. Why do we not ask people before we prescribe an aminoglycoside if anyone in their mum's family has ever gone deaf after having an antibiotic? That's free, doesn't cost anything. Why do we not do it? These have been totally siloed, family health history, pedigree analysis, and pharmacogenomics in ways that make no sense at all, but even less sense if you talk about something like mitochondrial inheritance. So it's a super interesting question. I'd love to hear more later, and I think it's an area we could all do a lot more in, honestly.
So very quick,
Very
because
quick.
look, they're gasping.
Because that was the original proposed from Maria Bittner back in 2010, who proposed that as a model. And I think the challenge is, as Emma said, the health economics of it. And as part of a project we have, again, Professor Payne is looking at the health economics of RNR1 testing. And so we want to deliver the model that works best for patients and the healthcare system, irrespective of what technology you're using. The reason that falls down at the moment is just on the scale of testing that you would need to implement. But as technology develops, as it adapts, that may be a model going forward.
So listen, we've established that patients are absolutely critical. Oh,
Sue's just got a comment to this, okay?
So a couple of comments really, Viv, if I'm still live. First of all, I think the point that John made is really important, and we are looking at, John, and also whether we introduced extended blood group genotyping at birth. So you have your extended blood group genotypes. That's important for our diverse populations. And I think that conversation about aminoglycoside toxicity testing needs to be part of that. The second point I wanted to make, which was about the whole data flows, the unified genomic record will enable data to be available in primary care. And so you won't have to think about it. Patients will get their own PGX result, but then the primary care team will already have it, because if it's tested in the NHS, it will go out, it will be available both to secondary care and primary care. So they'll have it. It won't be the patient showing the primary care team. It will already be there. And as part of the build, there will be alerts for doctors to know, and nurses to know, and pharmacists and everybody else to know that there's a patient that might have a sort of an adverse drug reaction and how severe that might be. My other question, though, Viv, and the panel will not have a chance to answer this, is the point I made in my presentation was we're testing at 40,000 a year at the moment, and the studies we're talking about so far at a small scale. If we go to 1 million, this is wide scale testing, widespread. How do you think some of the things that you've all said might change if this is commonplace? So although this is not going to be as commonplace as measuring, you know, doing your standard testing, blood testing, using these and other tests, this will be fairly commonplace testing in the NHS. So how would you change your approaches to take that into account? I'd be really interested to know what the path is.
okay, very briefly, because you are all gasping. Mark, let's come to you.
I think it would just be better health outcomes for everyone, really. The more you're going to increase the scale of this study and the availability of the results, the better health the individual is going to have. So in my case, let's say the SSRIs, if I was one on a drug which would make me even gain more weight, then I'm going to be in a category of people who might be more susceptible for other clinical conditions which are then linked to obesity. So it's all links together, and that if I am preventing some adverse events, some which may also lead to other conditions, then what I'm receiving, if this is going to a large scale, is better outcome for myself and more money available to be.
But are you worried, Sue, about the tsunami that is going to...
I'm talking about, we're doing small scale testing.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is really increasing this, and it's making it more commonplace. And it could be done and the data could be gained from a variety of different purposes. It could be derived from whole genome sequencing. It could be done on point of care. It could be done a high volume, high scale panel testing that's very, very cheap. It's just, would you change any of the things you said as we move to it being,
Good.
from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands?
I think what I would change or add to what I've already said in terms of moving beyond PPIE, and one of my friends that works in a different industry, when I've told them all about pharmacogenomics, and they said why wouldn't you do it? They've said what you need is not PPIE, what you need is a marketing plan. How are you going to educate, communicate, and bring along the public with you?
That's why I say the
this?
patients are your advocates.
Yeah, so your example of Good Morning Britain or whatever, those are the kind of things and strategies that we need to think about. How are we going to take our public and our healthcare professionals with us along that journey?
But I think that the work that Emma and myself presented, I don't think that changes irrespective of the scale. Yes, your testing approach might change, but actually your models of service delivery, what people want from this as individuals, I can't see that dramatically changing.
And I still think that having your data yourself on your phone is really important, because this kind of thing going through the NHS, it can go through very quickly in some places, but be super slow in other places. And actually, if you've got it on your phone, then it doesn't matter that it hasn't quite reached Barrow in Furness.
Yeah, I think these are things to try to reach scale, right? Like right now, if an oncologist does some testing for toxicity in their siloed clinic that applies to one drug, and then they use that to optimize medicine for one person, I think, we've got no concerns. I think there's nothing complicated about that. I don't think patients object. I don't think, it's particularly useful for them to have that on their phone, because it's very siloed, right? So I think these are really future concerns about scale in terms of policy, in terms of access.
And having lots of things and it being preemptive rather than always being...
Exactly. But I think also in terms of health equity and getting uptake across different populations who may have trust problems. We saw not everyone wanted COVID vaccines equally. These are not problems I think we can afford to forget if we talk about population level implementation of any genetic service, even if it's just a medicine optimization tool. And I think we need to remember that probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, we are going to have to stop this because, look, they're like fish out of water. So
don't you know we need coffee?
We need coffee.
We need coffee.
We need coffee. Coffee, and we are going to be back at 12:15.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Viv.
Welcome back to the next session. I'm Anne Daly, Professor Emerita of Pharmacogenetics at Newcastle University, and I'm acting as chair here. So this is a slightly more formal rather than panel discussion session, but I'm hoping that we will be able to get a little bit of audience participation. So the title of the session is Challenges and Opportunities in Delivering a Pharmacogenomics Laboratory Service. And the first of two speakers is Ron van Schaik. I've known Ron for a very long time. He's a full professor at the Erasmus Medical College in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And he's really a pioneer of this field, especially in offering a clinical service in pharmacogenomics. Now, I think it is fair to say that the Dutch system has adopted pharmacogenomics slightly more rapidly than we have in the UK. There are some important differences between the healthcare system in the Netherlands and in the UK, but I think we can learn an awful lot from what has been achieved so far in the Netherlands. So I'll call on Ron to tell us his experiences in Rotterdam.